I never imagined the moment my life would crack open would feel so ordinary. No dramatic music, no cinematic lightning flash. Just the steady hum of traffic and the familiar turn of my steering wheel after another long day at work. If someone told me back then that a single glance through a cafe window would reroute the entire trajectory of my life, I would have laughed it off. But that was before I learned how betrayal doesn't knock. It just walks in, sits down, and makes itself at home. The day it happened, I was driving home through streets I'd traveled 1,000 times. I was tired, the type of tired that settles deep in the bones after weeks of quiet stress. Bills, deadlines, routine things that chip away at you without making much noise. I expected to go home, drop my bag near the door, kick off my shoes, and fall into the soft, predictable evening I shared with the woman I had loved for more than a decade. Instead, fate nudged me, gently, almost politely, down a small detour I hadn't planned. A road closure up ahead forced me to reroute through downtown. Annoying, but nothing unusual. I sighed, turned the wheel, and ended up rolling past a place I didn't care about. A little cafe with a green awning and outdoor tables that always seemed too small to balance a proper cup of coffee on. And that was when I saw her, my wife, sitting at a table near the large front window. Her face turned toward someone I didn't recognize. I slowed down without realizing it. Cars behind me edged forward impatiently, but I hardly noticed. The woman I'd built a life with was sitting in a golden wash of afternoon light, looking softer, younger, almost glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her hair fell over her shoulder in the exact way it did when she was fully relaxed, when she forgot the world for a second and let herself simply exist. But she wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man I'd never seen. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table as if he'd done it 100 times. His posture wasn't cautious or formal. It was comfortable, familiar, too familiar. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. He smiled. She smiled back. That interaction was more damning than any physical betrayal could have been. There are smiles you give strangers, smiles you give coworkers, smiles you give friends you haven't seen in a while. And then there are smiles that say something intimate has already happened. Maybe not physically, but emotionally. Smiles that reveal history, connection, momentum. She was smiling like that. Not at me, at him. And the strangest part was that she looked happier than she had in a long time. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. My breath caught in my chest. A sudden short inhale that felt like a vacuum. I wasn't angry. Not yet. It was something colder, more primitive. A sense that the ground under me had shifted, but I was the only one who noticed. Traffic finally pushed me forward. I didn't stop the car. I didn't storm inside. I didn't do anything dramatic or impulsive. I kept driving, letting the cafe shrink in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. But the image burned itself into my mind, sharper than anything I'd ever seen. When I reached the house, I sat in the driveway for a long moment, staring at the front door like it was a puzzle I needed to solve. The house looked normal, peaceful, almost welcoming, but I felt like a stranger pulling up to a place I only recognized from old photographs. I walked inside, expecting something to be different, but everything looked the same. Her shoes were neatly lined by the door. The living room was clean and quiet. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, familiar and unthreatening. It was strange how betrayal leaves no physical trace, only an invisible bruise across your chest. That evening, she came home later than usual. Her expression was relaxed, almost cheerful, the way someone looks after being around someone who makes them feel seen. She moved through the kitchen, humming lightly under her breath. I watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with a new awareness. A heightened perception that came from knowing the truth even before you had the facts. People think betrayal is loud, but the real thing is subtle. She wasn't colder toward me. She wasn't distant. If anything, she seemed lighter, more alive, as if she had rediscovered a part of herself, but not with me. I didn't confront her. Not that night. Not the next. Instead, I started watching the details. She suddenly guarded her phone more. She checked it often, her expression softening in these small private moments when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Her outfits changed too, slightly nicer, more intentional. She didn't buy anything dramatic, but her choices were different. She looked like someone who expected to be seen by someone who made her feel important. There were little changes in her routine. Extra time before leaving the house. Occasional delays getting home. Vague explanations about errands or conversations with friends that didn't quite match her usual patterns. It wasn't evidence yet, but it was enough to confirm that something was shifting. The moment I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore came late one evening. We were sitting on the couch watching a show we used to enjoy together. She leaned against the opposite armrest instead of me, legs curled under her, phone held at an angle that hid the screen. She smiled at something on the screen. Not the TV screen, but the one in her hand. That same smile I'd seen in the cafe window. Gentle, soft, intimate in a way she didn't show me anymore. My heart sank into a cold, heavy stillness. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't overreacting. Something was happening, and it was happening quietly, just beneath the surface of our everyday life. The next day, I made a decision that changed everything. I wasn't going to confront her without certainty. Not because I wanted to catch her in some twisted game, but because I needed to face reality without denial clouding my judgment. I needed the truth. Not her version of it. Not an interpretation. The truth. I started by checking small things. Not invading her privacy, but paying attention. The times she said she was with friends didn't always match up with the subtle inconsistencies in her day. The way she carried herself when she left the house spoke of someone preparing for more than just errands. Eventually, my suspicions solidified into certainty. She wasn't just drifting away. She wasn't just distracted. She was involved, with someone who made her light up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I didn't need to know much about him yet. Not his name, not his background, not how long it had been going on. Because the expression on her face in the cafe had told me everything. That was the expression of a woman whose heart had already crossed a line she couldn't come back from. The funny thing about betrayal is that it doesn't start with actions. It starts with absence. The absence of honesty. The absence of effort. The absence of the connection that once held two people together. Late one night, when she was asleep, I sat alone in the living room staring at the ceiling. The house felt heavier than usual, like it carried the weight of the truth I hadn't yet spoken. I realized that I had two choices. I could continue pretending, letting the slow decay of our marriage happen quietly around me, or I could face the truth head-on, no matter how much it hurt. Pretending wasn't an option. Not for me. Not for the man I had always tried to be. But I also knew I needed more than suspicion. I needed clarity. Solid ground. Something undeniable. I approached the truth methodically, not because I wanted ammunition, but because I wanted certainty. I wanted to rebuild my future on something real, not the fog of half-guessed assumptions. I learned to read her patterns, her moods, her excuses dressed as explanations. The more I watched, the clearer the picture became. She wasn't drifting by accident. She was moving with direction, just not toward me. Weeks went by like this, with each small observation carving a deeper fissure inside me. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires energy. I was too drained for that. What I felt instead was a quiet resignation mixed with a steady resolve. The moment that broke the last remnants of denial came on a Wednesday evening. She came home later than usual. Her hair was tousled in a way that suggested someone else's hands or someone else's presence. There was a new scent on her clothes. Something masculine, something unfamiliar. She didn't even notice. Or maybe she did, but assumed I wouldn't. She moved through the house as usual, talking about her day with an ease that sounded practiced. I watched her closely, feeling something inside me slowly detach from the life I thought we had. That night, while she slept, I went into the hallway bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. The reflection didn't shock me. Not the tired eyes or the tightened jaw. What struck me was the realization that the man in the mirror wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. He was preparing. Preparing for the end. preparing for the conversation that would change everything, preparing to reclaim his life from someone who had already started planning to leave it. I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I was afraid of living a lie. The next morning, she moved around the kitchen with the same routine motions she always had. Coffee, toast, the small hum under her breath. But the silence between us had shifted. She sensed it. She looked at me more often, studying me carefully, searching for something she couldn't quite place. She knew something was coming. Not what, not when, but she felt the distance growing. Not just between us, but inside me. I watched her sip her coffee, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of grief. Not for her, but for the version of us that once existed. The version we lost somewhere along the way, long before another man entered the picture. I realized then that the hardest part of betrayal wasn't the act itself. It was accepting that the person you thought you knew had already changed into someone you didn't recognize. By the time she left for work, my decision was made. I wasn't going to confront her in anger. I wasn't going to demand explanations. I wasn't going to beg or bargain or break. I was going to take the steps I needed to take, for myself, not for her. And so, that afternoon, I took the first real step toward the end of our marriage. I gathered important documents, insurance papers, financial statements, bank records, not to weaponize them but to protect myself, to prepare. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning liberation. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. I wasn't searching for it. It simply landed in my lap, the way truth often does when you finally stop resisting it. She left her laptop open on the kitchen island. A message notification popped up with a preview that revealed more than she would have ever told me willingly. It wasn't explicit, not in a physical sense, but the emotional intimacy was unmistakable. It was the kind of message you send to someone who holds your heart in their hands, not your spouse who sleeps beside you every night. I didn't open the full message. I didn't need to. The truth was right in front of me. She loved someone else, and she wasn't going to tell me. She wasn't going to end the marriage. She wasn't going to take responsibility. She was waiting for me to break so she wouldn't have to. But I wasn't going to break. I was going to walk forward. The decision settled into me with a calm I didn't expect. Not rage, not despair. Quiet, resolute acceptance. The kind of acceptance that comes from acknowledging the truth without flinching. I took a long breath, feeling the weight of years of routine and memories and shared promises settle into clarity. The marriage was over. It had ended long before I saw her in the café. That moment had simply revealed what my heart had already known. And now I was ready to move toward the second part of the story. Not destruction, not chaos, but rebuilding. Even if rebuilding meant walking away from the person I once vowed to stay with forever. Because vows mean nothing when only one person is still living by them. And I refused to live the rest of my life carrying someone else's unfinished goodbye. The morning after everything crystallized into undeniable truth, the world outside looked deceptively calm. The sun rose the same way it always had, spilling gold across the neighborhood roofs. Birds chattered on branches with their usual unbothered rhythm, completely unaware that a marriage inside one of those houses had quietly died. She moved through the morning like someone trying to act normal, but something in her rhythm was off. Her steps were hesitant, her breath a little too shallow. She watched me more carefully than she had in months, studying my expression as if searching for a verdict in the lines of my face. Maybe she sensed the shift. Maybe she felt the weight of what was coming. Maybe she finally recognized that I wasn't carrying confusion anymore. Only clarity. It didn't matter, because what stood between us now wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a rough patch. It wasn't something that needed fixing. It was the truth, fully exposed, standing in the middle of our kitchen like a witness neither of us could deny. She left for work with a quiet stiffness in her posture. The door closed gently behind her, but the silence that followed felt like an avalanche. I stayed in the kitchen for a long moment, breathing in the fading scent of her perfume, knowing it no longer belonged to me. It belonged to someone else, and so did she. The rest of the day became the start of an unspoken unraveling. The lawyer's office wasn't where I expected to find clarity, but that's exactly what happened. The air inside was clinical and quiet, lined with shelves full of legal volumes and framed certificates. People generally go there to end things. Marriages, partnerships, disagreements, and I was simply another man sitting with a folder of documents and a truth heavy in his chest. The lawyer explained everything with the calm efficiency of someone who had untangled dozens of lives like mine. There was a strange comfort in the structure he described. Divorce wasn't emotional in that room. It wasn't personal. It was procedural, linear, a series of steps that, once taken, simply led forward. He talked about marital assets. He talked about rights. He talked about timelines. He talked about custody if children were involved, something we didn't have to face. He talked about fair distribution and legal protection. And with every word, I felt a piece of my fear dissolve. Not because divorce was painless, but because understanding is always less terrifying than uncertainty. When I walked out of his office, the autumn wind hit my face with a sharpness that felt cleansing. I felt grounded, heavier, and lighter at the same time. I had taken the first real step toward ending something that had ended long ago. A part of me wondered if she sensed the shift from miles away. She returned home earlier than usual that night. The moment she stepped inside, I could tell she felt something different in the air. She froze for half a second, eyes darting across the room the way people do when they enter a place that no longer feels safe. She glanced toward the dining table where I had laid out a single manila folder. Nothing dramatic, just legal documents resting quietly in the space between us. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The presence of that folder said everything we hadn't said for weeks. Her face shifted. First confusion, then realization, then a hollow kind of resignation. Not the wild panic of someone caught, not the outrage of someone wrongly accused. Just acceptance. The kind that only comes when a person knows the truth has finally reached them. She walked past me slowly, like someone moving through the ruins of their own choices, touching nothing, saying nothing, leaving everything unsaid. She went upstairs, leaving the folder untouched, but I could feel the echoes of her glance lingering behind me. The silence that filled the house wasn't normal, not comfortable, not routine. It was the silence of acknowledgement, the moment both people finally see the same truth. We were done. Not because of the documents, not because of the affair, but because neither of us fought for the marriage anymore. It was a house full of memories standing on a foundation that had already crumbled. In the weeks that followed, our house became a negotiation table without words spoken aloud. Every morning and every evening brought the same routine. A shared space, but separate lives. Two people moving around each other like ghosts who once had form and emotion but were now reduced to motions and necessities. She started spending more time away. Longer hours at work, more afternoons out, more weekends with vague explanations. I didn't ask where she went. I didn't check. I didn't track. I didn't need to. The emotional connection had already snapped like a frayed rope. When she was home, she avoided the spaces where I sat. She drifted into other rooms, other corners, keeping a polite but deliberate distance. There were no fights, no raised voices, no accusations. The absence of conflict was almost eerie. People imagine divorcing couples as erupting in anger. But sometimes the anger has already burned out by the time the breakup happens. We divided our things in silence. A sweater folded and placed on her side of the bed. A stack of books on mine. Picture frames turned face down on the dresser until we could decide what to do with them. Even the air around us had a new temperature, cooler, lacking the warmth of partnership, filled instead with the sharp, metallic scent of endings. There was one moment I'll never forget, a moment that sealed everything. I walked into the living room and found her sitting on the couch with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the blank screen of the TV. She looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from the emotional weight of pretending things hadn't been falling apart for months. Our eyes met. She didn't look away, but she didn't try to reach across the distance either. In that silent exchange, I finally understood that her heart had left this marriage long before her body would. That was the moment I stopped seeing her as someone who betrayed me, I saw her instead as someone who had already mourned the end, long before I realized there was something to mourn. It didn't absolve her, but it explained her. The paperwork officially began the next Tuesday. Pages signed, notarized, sent, returned, reviewed, adjusted. It was astonishing how clinical the end of a marriage becomes when reduced to paper. Years of shared life shrunk into sections, clauses, and signatures. There were no dramatic scenes, no fights over who keeps what, no battles over money or property. She didn't try to take advantage. She didn't demand things. She didn't argue for more. Instead, she moved through the legal process with a kind of subdued compliance, the behavior of someone who knew she was in no position to negotiate anything beyond the basics. The lawyer explained that the lack of conflict would speed everything up, and he was right. What some couples spend years fighting over, we resolved in weeks. It wasn't painless, just simple, and simplicity was its own kind of mercy. As the months drew on, our house transformed from a home into a storage container for memories and unresolved questions. Every room had moments trapped inside it. Our laughter, our arguments, our plans, our disappointments. But all of those memories felt distant now, like someone else's life playing on a screen far away. She began packing what she planned to take. Clothes, personal items, books she loved, trinkets and mementos from childhood. A few gifts I had given her, carefully chosen over the years, she placed in a box without looking at them too long. I watched her pack once, not with bitterness, but with a strange bittersweet clarity. She moved slowly, with a careful precision, as if trying not to disturb the ghosts of who we used to be. There was no excitement in her movements, no relief, just acceptance. Maybe she expected me to interrupt. Maybe she thought I would say something, anything, to break the silence between us. But I had nothing left to say. Love had long slipped out the back door. All that remained was closure. The night before she moved out, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling around me. It felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves knew something was ending. She slept on the other side of the mattress, turned away from me, curled into herself. There was a time when I would have reached for her, placed a hand on her back, pulled her close. But those days were gone, and any attempt now would have been an intrusion into a space that was no longer mine. The emotional distance between us was colder than winter. Two people inches apart physically, but galaxies apart emotionally. I stared into the dark and let the truth sink in. Tomorrow the house would feel different. Whole rooms would be empty, shelves would be bare. But the emotional emptiness had arrived long before the physical signs. That night felt like standing between two versions of myself, the version who had believed in forever and the version who had finally accepted the truth. And acceptance, I learned, is a quiet thing. It doesn't roar, it settles. She moved out on a Saturday. The morning was cold, crisp, with a gray sky that hinted at rain. She carried boxes to her car one at a time, the silence between us stretching across the driveway like a long shadow. Neighbors glanced curiously, but no one asked questions. People sense when a marriage ends. They see it in posture, in silence, in distance. She placed the final box in her trunk and hesitated. Not out of regret, more like hesitation at the edge of a cliff she had already decided to jump from. She looked at the house, the driveway, the yard. And then she looked at me. It wasn't a look of apology, or sorrow, or longing. It was simply recognition that the life we built was now divided into two directions neither of us could walk back from. She got into her car, closed the door, and drove away. No dramatic chase, no final argument, no last-minute plea, just closure. A simple departure that carried years of consequence. I watched her car disappear down the street, feeling neither shattered nor relieved, only grounded in the truth that this was the ending both of us had created in different ways. When the last trace of her car vanished, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like months. Silence settled over the house, but it wasn't hostile anymore. It was empty in a way that invited rebuilding. In the days after she left, the house felt unnaturally clean. No clutter, no noise, just wide, open space, and the faint scent of fresh paint from the room I decided to start with. Rebuilding meant more than emotional healing. It meant reclaiming the physical space too. I rearranged furniture, moved the bed, repainted walls, laid new rugs, changed the layout of the living room. I wasn't erasing her. I was rediscovering myself. Each physical change felt symbolic, like stepping out of an old skin. Every corner I touched became a reminder that healing isn't a sudden breakthrough. It's 100 small decisions to choose yourself again. I found old hobbies, old playlists, old habits I had abandoned to make room for someone who wasn't staying. There was loneliness, yes, but there was also freedom. A steady, fragile freedom that grew stronger with each passing day. The final decree arrived months later. A simple envelope, thin, unassuming, yet heavy in its symbolism. The divorce was finalized. No battles, no courtrooms, no drama, just a legal acknowledgement of a truth we had both accepted long before the papers were signed. I held the document for a long moment, feeling neither triumph nor defeat, just closure. A quiet understanding that this was not the end of my life, only the end of a chapter that had run its course. I placed the papers in a drawer and closed it gently, and with that simple motion I let the past rest. Life didn't magically transform the moment the marriage ended. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were easier than others. Some moments hit harder than expected. A familiar scent, a photograph tucked in a forgotten drawer, the empty side of the bed. But slowly, steadily, something grew inside me. Strength, clarity, self-respect. I stopped blaming myself. I stopped replaying the betrayal. I stopped asking what if. Instead, I began asking what now. And the answer was simple. Now I rebuild. Now I grow. Now I move forward. The day I watched her through that cafe window had once felt like the end of everything. But as I stood in my living room months later, sunlight filling the space she once occupied, I realized something powerful. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a life I had forgotten I was allowed to have. A life built on honesty, on clarity, on self-worth, and most importantly, a life where the person I learned to rely on again was myself. I walked toward the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the fresh morning air. The world felt wider, brighter, unpredictable in the best possible way. There was no fear now, no weight, no shadow on my chest, just the quiet, calm realization that letting go isn't the same as losing. Sometimes letting go is the only way to finally find yourself again.